I stood up from the table and didn't say a word. My son rose first, not to leave, but to humiliate. "Dad, you're a loser," he said, loud enough for the whole dining room to turn its head. He smiled at my ex-wife's new husband, like he'd just delivered a winning line in a play. Grant Mercer leaned back in his tailored jacket and smirked, as though he'd rehearsed this moment. I folded my napkin slowly, the same way I'd close a blueprint when a project no longer made sense. If you're not subscribed, check now, because this isn't a story about money. It's about the quiet things people mistake for weakness. That night in the Meridian, under chandelier light sharp as winter ice, I didn't taste the steak on my plate or the wine I paid for. I just felt the room watching me. My suit was 10 years old, but it was clean, honest, not pretending to be anything other than what it was. My son Ethan wore success like a costume, loud and glittering. He mimicked the way Grant held his glass, the way he talked, even the little half-laugh Grant used whenever he wanted to signal superiority. I'd seen it all before. Men performing power because they didn't know how to earn it. When Ethan called me a loser, I didn't feel shock or anger. I felt something else, quiet certainty. That moment didn't break me. It revealed him. I rose from my chair without scraping the legs against the floor, placed the napkin beside the untouched dessert, and left the table. I walked past servers holding plates of things no one really needs, past walls coated in gold the way some people coat their insecurities. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. They thought my silence was surrender. They didn't understand that silence can also be a warning. I drove home through the Phoenix night. Windows down, warm desert air brushing against my face. I was 71 years old, and I'd built bridges across rivers, designed support structures for hospitals, repaired roads people depended on every day. Yet the people who had benefited most from my stability, my ex-wife, her new husband, and my son, treated me like the old scaffolding you toss aside once the building is finished. My house waited for me at the end of a quiet street, a single-story bungalow with a workshop attached. I built it 30 years ago with my own hands. No marble, no chandeliers, just cedar beams, and the honest smell of pine and dust. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the hum of the desert. I'd lived alone since Lydia left. At first, the silence was painful, sharp around the edges, but over time it settled around me like a familiar coat. Predictable, steady. The silence tonight felt different, denser, expectant, as if the air itself knew something had shifted. Inside, my house looked exactly the way I liked it. Simple, calm, everything in its place. On the wall hung my old engineering maps, blue lines on white paper like rivers of decisions. On the workbench sat a half-repaired wooden stool, a project I'd promised myself I'd finish before summer. I sat at the kitchen table, the one thing I'd kept from my parents' house, and let the moment at the Meridian play again in my head. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified everything. For years I'd brushed aside Ethan's comments. Old-fashioned, behind the times, too cautious. He'd always spoken like the world owed him more than he'd earned, and every time, I'd forgiven. Every time. I told myself it was just growing pains. Every time, I tried to be patient, because that's what fathers do. But patience without boundaries is just permission for someone to walk all over you. I didn't realize how far he'd walked until tonight. A small ache grew beneath my ribs, not from anger but from something quieter, a kind of grief. The boy I taught to ride a bike would never have spoken to me like that. The boy who used to wait for me on the porch after school, holding up his report card with pride, that boy was gone. Someone else had taken his place. Someone shaped by Lydia's vanity and Grant's empty confidence. Someone who had forgotten what stability looked like, because he'd never known how much of it came from me. I walked into my study. Every engineer has a room like this, part archive, part memory, part battlefield. The desk lamp cast a small circle of warm light, enough to see the old Dell computer I'd kept running long after most people would have replaced it. On the shelf above it stood a photograph of Ethan at 6 years old, wearing an oversized construction helmet, grinning as he sat on my shoulders at a job site. Every time I looked at that picture, I remembered how he used to say, I want to build things just like you, Dad. Somewhere along the way he traded building for pretending. My hand hovered over the computer mouse for a moment. Then, I turned on the monitor. The screen flickered awake, humming softly, steady, faithful, like an old friend. I opened the encrypted drive I hadn't touched in 8 years. It held folders with plain names. Hale Holdings, Westward Innovations, Skyline Vista Properties. Names Ethan never questioned. Names he didn't know, pointed straight back to me. I stared at them for a long time. And then I opened a blank email. My fingers moved slowly at first. Then, with certainty. Subject: Initiate Protocol Hale 7. Monica. It's time. I hit send. The message left the outbox with a soft, almost gentle sound. Like the click of a switch before a controlled demolition. I wasn't proud. I wasn't vindictive. I just knew there are moments in a man's life when he must decide whether he will continue enabling a lie or force the truth into daylight. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The desert wind brushed against the window. My house felt still, almost suspended. A strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm that comes when you've placed the first stone in a foundation you know will hold. In the corner of the desk lay a small leather notebook. I opened it to a page I hadn't looked at in years. At the top, in my own handwriting, were 3 scribbled words Ethan had never seen. If they ever cross the line. I traced the words with my thumb and closed the book. I wasn't angry. I was ready. By morning, the quiet in my house felt heavier, like the air before a monsoon rolls through the desert. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had pushed its pale light over the Phoenix rooftops. At my age, most things in my body ache a little. But that morning I felt something sharper, an old instinct awakening, the same one that stirred whenever a bridge inspection report landed on my desk with one line circled in red. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. And pretending otherwise would only make the collapse more violent later. I brewed a pot of coffee the way I always do. 1 scoop too strong, the way my father used to drink it, and sat at the small wooden table near the window. A hummingbird flicked between the cacti in my yard, moving with intention, darting forward, pulling back, assessing angles, risks, openings. Engineers work the same way, except people don't move as predictably as birds. People hide motives behind smiles, behind soft words, behind performances in expensive restaurants. I took a slow sip and let the heat settle in my chest. Across the street, Mrs. Hollings was watering her lemon tree. A normal morning in a normal neighborhood. But my life was no longer walking the line of normal. My phone buzzed once. Then again. The banking app flashing an alert. Unauthorized login attempt. Another. Suspicious transfer request. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words settle. Most people panic when they see warnings like that. But something in me stilled. Because I already knew who would try to reach into my accounts the moment they mistook my silence for weakness. Ethan had always believed money was fixed to emotion. If he cried, I'd pay. If he raged, I'd pay. If he shamed me publicly, well, that was just the next step in proving he had surpassed me. But this was different. This was coordinated. This smelled like Grant. He had the smooth confidence of a man who thought charm was a substitute for competence. And that access was something you could simply take if you spoke loudly enough. I forwarded the alerts to Monica Reyes and asked if she was free that morning. She replied in under 30 seconds. Come right away. Her office downtown sat on the 31st floor of a silver high-rise, all glass and steel, a building I once helped reinforce during its expansion 15 years ago. When I stepped into her boardroom, Monica was already there. Her hair pulled into a tight bun, reading glasses perched low, posture alert. She didn't greet me with small talk. She simply turned her laptop to face me. This started last night, she said. A transfer request to an entity called Mercer Family Foundation. My breath left me in a slow, measured stream. Grant's fingerprints were all over it. She clicked to the next file. Robert, whoever submitted this included a signature that looks almost identical to yours. I leaned in. The more I studied it, the more my stomach tightened. They hadn't traced my signature. They'd practiced it. This wasn't a desperate attempt. This was planned. and beneath that neat forgery sat words I'd never written. Full financial authority granted to Ethan Hale. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of fear, but out of disappointment so sharp it scraped bone. Monica's voice softened. You know what this is, right? It's a guardianship setup. Financial incapacitation. They're trying to declare you unfit to manage your own assets. When I opened my eyes, the room felt different, heavier. Guardianship abuse isn't something strangers attempt. It's something people closest to you weaponize, one signature at a time. My silence last night had become their green light. While she drafted preliminary responses, I stepped into the hallway to clear my head. That was when I saw Carla Jenkins, my neighbor, the nurse from Street Luke's, walking toward me. She looked surprised. Robert? I was just about to call you. She lowered her voice. Grant was at the hospital again, asking questions about your medical records, pressing staff to say you've been confused lately. Confused. The word hit differently. Not because it was true, but because it revealed exactly how they would frame their attack. She hesitated before adding, he even hinted someone could sign off, if the compensation was worth their time. There are moments in life when the floor tilts just a little. Not enough to knock you down, but enough to tell you the next steps will decide everything. I thanked her, and she squeezed my arm gently. Kindness, not pity. I needed that moment, more than I realized. Back in the office, Monica had pulled up surveillance footage from the Mailbox camera I'd installed last year, after a package theft incident in the neighborhood. She paused the frame. Recognize him? Ethan stood there, under the porch light, taking mail from my box. Beside him, Grant, arms crossed, impatient, like the mastermind of a poorly written heist. I felt something inside me quiet further. A tightening, a narrowing, a sense that whatever remained of innocence between us had slipped away. They're escalating faster than expected, Monica said. We need to respond decisively. She opened the encrypted folder, labeled Westward Innovations, the company Ethan believed he owned. You still hold 80% through Hale Holdings. If they're trying to incapacitate you, they'll try to seize the company next. I nodded slowly. Looking at the documents, I felt the same focus I used to feel standing beneath a bridge at dawn, hearing the river rush beneath beams I'd set myself. Everything here, every shell company, every signed contract, every buried clause had been built carefully, never to trap him, but to protect him. And me. From the day he might forget who built his foundation. The sun had shifted by the time I left the office, light bouncing off glass towers like shards of a broken mirror. As I stepped into the elevator, my phone buzzed a message from Monica. Prepare yourself. I'm sending you something. When I reached the parking lot, I opened the attachment. A draft legal petition. At the top, in the matter of the proposed guardianship of Robert Hale. Petitioners, Ethan Hale and Grant Mercer. My hands didn't shake, but something inside me settled. A long, steadying exhale. Because now, I knew exactly what they were willing to do. And I knew exactly what I had to do in return. I drove home along the long stretch of Bell Road, the desert sun hitting the windshield in bright, unforgiving flashes. But inside the car, it wasn't heat that pressed on my chest, it was clarity. A strange, cold-edged clarity. The kind a person only feels when the truth finally steps out of the shadows and stands in front of them. Undeniable. Guardianship. They wanted to erase me while I was still breathing. When I pulled into my driveway, the air felt heavier. Something in the quiet told me I wasn't alone. I stepped out of the car and heard the crunch of gravel, my neighbor, Carla, crossing over from her yard. She held a sealed envelope in her hand, her expression tight. This was taped to your door, she said. I didn't want you walking up to it alone. I took it. The paper wasn't cheap. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with a law firm logo. I recognized instantly. Mercer and Hale. The firm Grant sometimes bragged about being connected to, though, in truth, he only had a cousin who worked there. Inside was a single document titled, Request for Emergency Capacity Assessment. Someone had signed my name at the bottom. Not a perfect forgery, but close enough that someone unfamiliar would believe it. My throat tightened, not out of fear, but out of disappointment so deep, it felt geological. My son had once held my hand crossing a street in Calgary, afraid of slipping on the winter ice. And now here he was, forging paperwork to take my life out of my own hands. Carla watched my face carefully. Robert, you need to understand. If this had gone through the hospital channels without anyone questioning it, you could have been declared medically compromised before you even knew it was happening. I nodded slowly. This wasn't just betrayal. This was an ambush. Inside my house? I laid the forged document on the kitchen table beside my old coffee mug. The morning sun angled through the blinds in thin, sharp stripes across the paper, like prison bars. I stared at it, then opened my laptop. If they wanted a guardianship war, they were stepping into a battlefield I'd reinforced years ago. I opened the secure drive labeled North Star Archive, a file of documentation I'd quietly collected over the past decade. Not because I anticipated betrayal, but because structure is a habit engineers never break. Inside were bank statements, transaction logs, message backups, and surveillance captures from various properties I owned. But what mattered now was the file labeled Mercer, consulting payments, line after line, $52,000 per month, authorized by Westward Innovations. Each payment traceable back to accounts under Ethan's privileged access. And ultimately, back to me. In the wrong hands, those records could frame me as the one dependent on them. But in the right hands, they would reveal who was propping up whom. A knock sounded at the door. Not frantic, not forceful, measured, controlled. When I opened it, Monica stood there with a folder in her hand and a look that said she was bracing for the worst. They accelerated the petition, she said. They filed it this afternoon. But they don't know something we do. She stepped inside, lowered her voice. They attached a medical affidavit, signed by a nurse at Street Luke's. My chest tightened. Carla? No, she said. Someone else. Someone who hasn't seen you once in 6 months. She opened the folder. But the signature? Forged. Sloppy. And the timestamp is impossible. The nurse was on leave that day. It was surreal. Standing in my living room, while my own son assembled a legal case, by stacking lies like rotting planks. One step wrong, and the whole thing would collapse. Robert, we need evidence. Stronger than forged signatures, stronger than bank logs. I took a slow breath, then nodded toward the hallway. I have some. We walked to my study, my sanctuary, my archive. I pulled out a locked drawer beneath the old drafting table. Inside were 2 USB drives, one labeled Westward, ownership and board records, and the other, Mercer activity logs. Monica plugged in the first drive. On my monitor, the corporate structure blossomed like a blueprint. Clean, precise, irrefutable. 80% ownership, she whispered, and a clause in the founding bylaws stating that if the CEO engages in fraudulent activity against the primary stakeholder, she looked at me sharply, they can be suspended immediately. Suspended, removed, shut out of the very world he believed he built. A heaviness settled into my bones. Not triumph, not revenge. Something quieter, something like mourning. But we weren't finished. Monica opened the second drive and pulled up a sequence of digital timestamps showing Grant entering a restricted office suite belonging to Westward Innovations' financial department, a suite only high-level employees should access. Grant was not one of them. Then the footage from my mailbox camera. Ethan and Grant removing mail. Grant holding my financial statements. Ethan pocketing letters. Monica exhaled slowly. This isn't just a guardianship attack. This is coordinated financial manipulation. She leaned back, her face shifting from concern to calculation. We can take this to court, Robert. And, when we do, it won't be you on trial. But as she spoke, I noticed something on the footage, something small but significant. In one clip, Ethan hesitates before opening one of the envelopes. His hand trembles not from thrill, but from fear. That tremor lodged in my mind like a thorn. Was he still the boy who once rested his head on my shoulder during thunderstorms? Or was that boy gone, buried beneath Grant's voice and Lydia's ambition? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. We weren't finished. Monica packed the files, her motions crisp and certain. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go public. A full hearing. Evidence, testimony, exposure." Her eyes hardened. "They wanted a battlefield? We'll give them one." As she left, the house fell quiet again. My quiet. My terms. I walked into the yard, the desert light softening as the sun dipped low. A coyote barked in the distance. The world felt steady beneath my feet, as if reminding me that truth doesn't flinch, even when people do. Tomorrow would not be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. The morning of the hearing felt colder than it should have for Arizona. Not weather cold, air cold. The kind that settles inside your ribs when you know the day will demand something from you that you can't take back. I dressed carefully. Plain shirt. The older navy blazer I wore whenever I visited job sites. Boots I'd resoled twice. Nothing fancy. Nothing loud. Just the clothes of a man who had always built his life rather than decorated it. Outside the courthouse, the sun bounced off the sandstone facade, making everything look harsher, brighter. Monica walked beside me, crisp and composed, carrying a binder so thick it looked like it could anchor a small boat. When we stepped through security, I felt eyes on me. Guardianship cases draw attention, they whisper, of family conflict, of someone losing control of their life. Most people assume the older person is confused, vulnerable, drifting. I walked straight-backed, even though something inside me trembled like a fault line under pressure. When we entered the courtroom, I saw them. Ethan and Grant, sitting at the petitioner's table. My son's suit was too sharp, too new, something purchased in a rush to look authoritative. Grant sat beside him with the smug composure of a man who thought victory came from posture, not preparation. He leaned back in his chair, giving me the slightest nod, like he was welcoming me to a game he believed he'd already won. But the moment I looked at Ethan, something inside me twisted. He avoided my eyes, his hands fidgeted with a pen. His bravado was thinner today, stretched over something brittle. The judge entered. Papers shuffled. Formalities passed like slow-moving machinery. Then, the petitioners were invited to speak. Grant rose. "Your Honor, we are here today because Robert Hale, my partner's father, has shown increasing signs of cognitive decline." His voice oiled through the room. "Erratic financial decisions, memory lapses, confusion. We are concerned for his safety and his assets." He gestured at Ethan with a supportive hand. "His son is simply trying to protect him." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. "Mr. Hale, do you wish to respond now or wait until your counsel presents your case?" I felt my throat tighten, but I stood. "I'll speak now, Your Honor." A breath moved through the room. People always expect the elderly to remain seated. But I walked to the witness stand, placed my hand on the edge, steadying myself without holding on. "I'm 71, I said. "My knees ache when the weather changes, and I can't drink coffee after 5 without losing sleep. But confusion is not part of my life." I turned, letting my gaze fall on Ethan. Not sharp, not accusatory, just steady. "What is part of my life is silence. The kind you use when you don't want to escalate conflict. The kind you mistake for peace. Sometimes that silence becomes a target." I sat, and Monica rose. Her presence changed the air. Calm, organized, relentless beneath the surface. She approached the bench and placed 3 folders before the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "we intend to show not only that Mr. Hale is entirely competent, but that the petitioners have engaged in coordinated financial manipulation, forged documents, and attempted unlawful guardianship for personal gain." Grant shifted. "The first crack. Exhibit A," she continued, "is the forged signature submitted on an emergency assessment request." She held up the original document. The judge studied it. "This is not Mr. Hale's handwriting," Monica said, "nor is it his signature. We present handwriting analysis confirming forgery, as well as testimony from hospital staff, indicating the signature of the nurse on this form is impossible, given she was out of the country that day." Gasps rippled. Grant's posture stiffened. Ethan's face drained of color. Then Monica opened the next folder. Exhibit B. Financial activity logs from Westward Innovations. These logs show unauthorized attempts to access Mr. Hale's accounts. followed by a prepared transfer request to an entity controlled by Mr. Mercer. She allowed the silence to stretch. Not theatrical, just truthful. Next, she continued, we present surveillance footage from Mr. Hale's residence footage, showing both petitioners removing mail, including confidential financial records. The judge leaned forward. Play it. And there it was on screen. The dim glow of my porch light. Ethan looking over his shoulder. Grant tapping his foot impatiently. Ethan taking envelopes. Grant pocketing one. Mini hook. The room collectively inhaled. Grant stood abruptly. This is being taken out of context. It's time-stamped, Monica said simply. Context is your action. Then she placed the final folder on the table. Exhibit C. Corporate records from Westward Innovations. Mr. Hale holds 80% ownership, meaning he is not dependent on his son. In fact, the reverse is true. The company's financial stability is entirely due to Mr. Hale's private investments. The judge's expression changed, not anger, not surprise, a kind of disappointed clarity. You're telling me, the judge said slowly, that the petitioners attempted to declare this man incompetent, while simultaneously relying on his assets to support themselves. Yes, Your Honor. Ethan's breath caught audibly. His shoulders curled inward, as though bracing against a blow he knew he deserved. The judge turned to him. Mr. Hale, did you understand the consequences of this petition? Ethan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His voice cracked. Grant jabbed him with an elbow, whispering harshly. But Ethan shook his head, a small, fragile gesture. I didn't think it would go this far, he whispered. Something inside me trembled. Not relief, not vindication, but grief sharpened into truth. Grant rose again, voice raised. Your Honor, this is an orchestrated attempt. Sit down, Mr. Mercer. The judge's tone cracked through the room like a snapped beam under pressure. Monica stepped back, her case presented. Everything laid bare. Evidence, motive, intent. As the judge prepared to speak, Ethan finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Not like an obstacle. Not like a burden. Like someone he recognized from a long time ago. A man who once tied his skates at the rink. Who fixed the wheels on his bike. Who told him the difference between strength and noise. But recognition doesn't erase consequence. The judge picked up her pen. This petition is denied. Permanently. Furthermore, there will be a formal review of Mr. Mercer's conduct and potential charges for forgery and fraudulent guardianship filings. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Sharp. Final. Grant froze. Ethan collapsed into his seat. Monica closed her binder with a soft, decisive click. And I inhaled, letting the weight of the moment settle. Public exposure wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. Like truth finally standing up after years of being pushed down. When the courtroom emptied, I didn't stand right away. The sound of the gavel still echoed in the hollow space behind my ribs. Not triumph. Not relief. Something quieter. Something like closure bending slowly into place. Monica gathered the last of the files, her expression softening only when she looked at me. It's over, she said gently. But I knew something she didn't. Court may end with a gavel, but family endings come in silence. I stepped into the hallway, where the polished floors reflected the sharp, overhead lights. Ethan was standing near a bench, shoulders curled forward, hands shaking slightly as he tried to loosen the knot of his tie. He didn't look like the man who raised his voice at a crowded restaurant. He looked smaller, younger, lost. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes met mine, and for a moment, the hallway felt too quiet, too exposed. Grant hovered beside him, still fuming, still whispering things meant to incite rather than comfort. But Ethan didn't seem to hear him. He just stared at me, the same way he'd stared the first time he realized thunder couldn't hurt him, only scare him. Dad, he whispered, and the word cracked in the middle. Not from shame, from fear. I walked closer, stopping a few feet from him, close enough to hear his breathing, far enough that he had to choose the next step himself. I didn't know, he said. I mean, I knew what Grant planned, but I didn't think it would destroy you. Monica paused a few steps away, watching silently. She understood this wasn't a legal moment, it was a human one. You forged my name, I said quietly. You took my mail. You tried to take ownership of my life. Ethan flinched. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I didn't sign the papers. Grant did. And you let him. Those 4 words hit him harder than anything else. His face crumpled, not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to show the truth. He finally understood the weight of his choices. Dad, I was scared, he said. The company was slipping, and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that the money would fix everything, that Grant knew what he was doing, that I couldn't ask you for help without proving him right about you being. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I'd carried that word long enough to recognize it in unfinished air. Ethan, I said, being a man has nothing to do with pretending you're strong, or performing power in front of strangers, or building castles on someone else's foundation. His eyes filled with something distant memory, maybe, or regret. But you didn't deserve what we did, he whispered. I pushed you. I let him push me. I let Mom talk about you like you were. He didn't finish that either. The air between us stretched thin and fragile. A lifetime of choices suspended between 2 breaths. Grant stepped forward, jaw tight. You don't owe him anything, Ethan. We can still fight this. There are appeals, alternate assessments. Grant, Ethan said without raising his voice. Stop. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. But it was the first thing he'd said all day that sounded like his own voice. Grant blinked, thrown off balance. Ethan, I said, stop. For the first time since I'd known him, Grant Mercer looked uncertain, like a man standing on steel he suddenly realizes is rusting. He backed away, anger flickering beneath his polished exterior. But he didn't leave. Men like him rarely know when the story is over. I turned to Ethan. Go home, I said softly. Not to the penthouse. Not to the noise. Go somewhere quiet. Sit with yourself. Figure out which part of you made these choices, and which part of you wants to change. He looked down at the floor, nodding through a tremor in his chin. Will you ever forgive me? I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because forgiveness shouldn't be handed out like a receipt. It should be earned. I don't know yet, I said. Forgiveness isn't the first chapter. It's the last. And you're still writing the beginning. Tears slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe them away. He simply nodded once, as if accepting a sentence he'd given himself. He walked out of the courthouse alone. Grant followed behind, calling his name. But Ethan didn't turn back. Thus, Problemander. A.D. The talons of the commode. That evening, I sat on my porch as the desert sky shifted from gold to violet. The air cooled, brushing against my skin like a quiet apology from the world. I watched the light fade behind the mountains, the same way I'd watched it fade for decades, slowly, honestly, without performance. My house, small, plain, sturdy, felt like a refuge again. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next crisis, the next request for money, the next manipulation disguised as family conversation. I poured myself a glass of water with lemon, breathed in the scent of the garden sage, and listened to the hum of insects rising with the dusk. Everything simple, everything real. People talk about justice like it's loud, but sometimes, justice is quiet. A boundary drawn, a truth spoken, a life reclaimed. I don't know what future waits for my son. I hope he learns. I hope he builds something real, something that doesn't require tearing someone down. But I do know this: silence is no longer my weakness. It is my choice. And I choose peace. Now I want to hear what you would have done if you stood where I stood. Tell me, would you forgive them? Or would you choose justice? If this story stayed with you, subscribe for the next true Canadian family story. And tell me, from which city or town are you listening tonight?